While there is a world trend on the inclusion of persons with disability in this complex society, the rights of a disabled person in developing countries, particularly in India, are almost non existent, where the rights of a girl or a woman are also vulnerable. Women and girls with disability thus face twice the discrimination. Shanta Memorial Rehabilitation Center, a credible disabled persons organization (DPO) based in Orissa, India, along with Development Research Institute presents e-courses to increase knowledge on gender issues focusing on gender-based violence against women with disabilities, living independently and inclusion in the society from a human rights perspective. This web based course is titled Insidious Violence and Women with Disabilities. This academic endeavor was designed keeping in mind the COVID 19 restrictions and the shift of focus from classroom lectures to a virtual learning environment.
First of all, good morning to all the participants. I am Kuhu from Calcutta, and I'm also working in the field of disability rights, and especially in gender and disability with women with disabilities for a long time. And I'm really honored today to have the opportunity of chairing this session. So once again, welcome to all the participants. Today we have two distinguished speakers um, with us to do the session. Hope you all have enjoyed the last sessions that you have participated in the last few days. And today we are going to have the unit 6 or 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Unit 5. And the topic of today's session is knowledge on issues around gender-based violence against disabled women within institutions and communities. And very pleased to tell that today we have two very experienced speakers with us to do the session. First we have Niluka Gunawardene, and then we have Shampa Sengupta. Niluka is from Sri Lanka and Shampa is from Kolkata, West Bengal. I will not waste much time. I will just give a small introduction of Niluka and Shampa to start with. Um, Niluka Gunawardene is an educator, researcher and disability rights advocate based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Niluka has a Master of Arts degree in Disability and Gender from the University of Leeds, and she teaches disability studies at the University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka. She is a faculty member of the Disability, Sexuality and Rights Online Institute hosted by Korea. Niluka has many other degrees and things in her bag. I'm not going into all those, but I can definitely want to say this, that Niluka regularly conducts community training workshops on disability rights using the CRPD SDGs framework for a multitude of NGOs and DPOs. She also influences disability inclusive corporates policy. She works a lot on that. And with that few words, I introduce Niluka and hope that you all will enjoy and learn a lot from her deliberation today.
The speaker of this web course is educator, researcher, and disability rights advocate Niluka Gunawardene from University Kalania, Sri Lanka, speaking on breaking the silence, generating and disseminating knowledge on the impact, experience, and prevention of GBV among women and girls with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Kuhu, for your kind and very welcoming introduction. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session where we are going to look at gender-based violence, especially in terms of the experience of women and girls with disabilities, and how knowledge creation, especially in terms of gender-based violence in institutional and community-based settings, the impact of that. Let me just check. Right. So I'm hoping that all of you can see my PowerPoint presentation at the moment. When we talk about gender-based violence, especially in the context of women and girls with disability, it's really a place where three systems of oppression or power come into interaction. So if you look at ableism, patriarchy, and heterosexism, we see that kind of raising its ugly head, especially when it comes to gender-based violence as experienced by women and girls with disabilities. So during this presentation, first we will look at how does that play out in terms of the lived experience of women and girls with disabilities. Then we'll look at how knowledge creation in this particular field can lead to greater emancipation and a greater sense of agency for women and girls with disabilities. Given that you have already done four courses or 4 days of work, you probably already have some kind of introduction to what gender-based violence is. But I'm just going to recap it a bit here, okay? So gender-based violence is violence that targets individuals or groups on the basis of their gender. And this really is kind of underscored by prevailing patriarchal values and norms, which tend to value, males over females, which tend to lead to the dehumanization and devaluation of women, and especially in interaction with ableism, women with disabilities. It is really an outward expression of the existing power inequalities within a society, especially along the lines of gender, right? And it is a manifestation of this need to keep women and girls, especially those with disabilities, in a subordinate state, in a state of oppression, in a state of invisibility and silence, right? When we talk about gender-based violence, most people immediately think of physical assault, sexual assault, rape, but there can be a far wider range of experiences that we might go through, especially as women and girls with disabilities when it comes to gender-based violence, okay? So, for example, in the case of disability, if someone deprives us of care, right? If we need assistance, if someone removes our assistive devices, and we'll talk about this in greater detail during this presentation, if, let's say, we are abandoned at birth due to our state of being a female disabled infant, there are so many very subtle ways, and also not so very subtle ways, in which gender-based violence plays out in the lives of especially women and girls with disabilities, right? This is not to say that men don't experience gender-based violence. There are definitely kind of situations where men also experience gender-based violence, and also along the lines of heteropatriarchy, especially, men who are considered to be LGBTIQ or queer, men and women who do not conform to gender ideals in a society, are also kind of vulnerable or prone to gender-based violence, right? Especially when it comes to women with disabilities, something that almost encourages, right? I'm not happy to use that word, but given the prevalence of violence in society, something that almost facilitates that violence is the perceived powerlessness, of us, women and girls with disabilities, right? Seen as vulnerable, seen as unable to fight back, unable to run, unable to speak and communicate, unable to represent ourselves in courts, where our testimonies and evidence is not taken seriously, especially based on our disability or impairment. All these factors lead to this assumption of powerlessness, which is often why women and girls with disabilities are vulnerable to gender-based violence. So like I've put up here, it's an ADD international Venn diagram. Often we see direct violence, right? The physical, psychological, economic violence perpetrated by individuals. But something that we can't really miss when we look at the structural sources of gender-based violence is this indirect violence, right? So like I was saying, right, in terms of what are the underlying, for example, stereotypes, okay? The assumption, let's say, that women with disabilities are asexual, or if it's like to do with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, the assumption that women with disabilities are hypersexual, okay? Assumptions like, if you have sex with a virgin and women with disabilities are virgins because they are not sexual, that you would be cured of HIV/AIDS, right? So we can have all these ideas that are there in relation to disability or any other axis of identification, really, that then leads to these kinds of overt forms of oppression, right? So before we kind of move on with the core content, I want to give you guys a quick quiz, okay? So I have put a couple of statistics, right? It's in black and bold on my screen. And then at the bottom are a couple of statements that are related to the statistics. Okay, so I've said on top, I've given a couple of statistics, right? So the statistics are, first one is 19.3%. Second one is 12%. Third one is 1 in 5 women. Fourth, 3/4. Fifth statistic is 65 to 70%. The final statistic is 10 times more likely, right? So the first one statement that I want you to match with the statistic is the disability prevalence rate for men. So if you have like a piece of paper and a pen with you, why don't you first, before I tell you what it is, try to take a guess at what the disability prevalence rate for men is, or given the statistics on the PowerPoint. Okay. Next, try to guess what the disability prevalence rate for women is. The third one, actually it should read women with disabilities are, okay, kind of to complete the sentence, women with disabilities are, what are they? Okay. Next statistic I want you to identify is women with disabilities living in rural areas. Okay. Next one, women with disabilities as a percentage of poor persons with disabilities in low and middle income countries. So countries like ours. Okay. And finally, those who are likely to experience violence, okay, compared to women without disabilities. So I think that is very easy given the sentence structure, right? More likely to experience violence compared to women with disabilities. Okay, now let's see how you did on the quiz. I'm just going to look at the core stats, okay, when it comes to women with disabilities. So let's see if you got this right. When we look at the prevalence rate of disability in the world, okay, what we see is there are a higher number of persons in terms of percentage, women with disabilities than men with disabilities. So the global prevalence rate of disability for women is 19.2%, whereas for men, it's 12%, right? Why do you guys think there is this differential between men and women when it comes to the incidence of disability? Does anyone have any ideas or kind of to stab in the dark and guess? Okay. So this is basically because things like malnutrition, poverty, neglect, right? Also the neglect of health conditions. Women, remember we talked about the patriarchal system where there's a devaluation of women, are more likely to experience these kind of things, which lead to a greater incidence of impairment, right? Even if you look at childbirth, right? This is like very common in certain countries, things like fistulas, right? Vaginal fistulas, where the whole process of giving birth in itself can result in impairments if not, if people don't receive the proper interventions. In terms of war and conflict, right? In Sri Lanka, we had a long civil war. It was a very dark moment in the history of our country, and there was a very high, I mean, apart from the combatants and the military personnel who were injured or acquired impairments in the process, many women also were, kind of, they acquired impairments through the process of conflicts. So because of the structural inequalities, women are more likely to experience disability, and also the aging population, right? The life expectancy for women is higher. And so as we age, many of us would experience some form of disabilities, right? So the next one was 3/4, and the statement for that is women with disabilities comprise 3/4 of all disabled people in low and middle income countries. So those are countries like ours, right? And what is really important here to remember is that of those 3/4, 65 to 70% live in rural areas, right? And I mean, you all are very, very familiar, especially in South Asian context, the great disparity of living conditions, of cultural conditions, of attitudinal environments, and the distinction between urban and rural areas. And we'll look at why that is important to factor in, right? Girls and young women with disabilities experience up to 10 times more violence than those without disabilities. A stark fact, but a reality that we really need to look at in order to transcend these kind of bleak stats, right? The incidence of maltreatment and abuse of women with disabilities far exceeds that of women without disabilities. Even children with disabilities, especially girls with disabilities, are particularly vulnerable. And in many cases, this is something that's important to remember, perpetrators of violence are usually caregivers, right? Either within the home environment or in institutional settings, okay? If you are, abused by people who are your carers, that puts you in a very compromising situation, right? Because of dependency for care or dependency for, sustenance, livelihood, for financial security. So it puts women and girls with disabilities in a very precarious situation, right? So very quickly, over the next, let's say 10 minutes, I want to walk you through violence during the life cycle of women and girls with disabilities, right? Because violence, it's very easy to kind of, see people on TV, maybe teledramas or soap operas, people slapping and screaming. And that is when we say violence, when we say domestic violence, those are the kind of thoughts that we have, right? Over physical violence. But especially when it comes to women and girls with disabilities, that violence is more insidious. And I think this course with the title itself captures that, right? Because it often happens in ways that we don't even perceive as violence in our psyche, right? So for example, with a lot of, especially little girls and infants with disabilities, the stigma around disability in our countries lead to abandonment, right? And neglect. And the isolation of such people and such children. I can remember when I was a little kid, I was going to a workshop to get a new little prosthetic arm, and my not occupational therapist, he was the physiotherapist. He said, there's another girl who's just like you, but she doesn't go to school, she doesn't go out, she just comes here these days to get a prosthetic arm done. And then he said how the parents didn't want the child to be seen by others and things like that. And honestly, like if I talk about disability consciousness, that was the first time when I went, oh my goodness, firstly, there's another girl like me, because, you know, when we are young, we are not exposed to disability and we don't even know, like I didn't know that there were other disabled people. And the second thing was this realization that, gosh, this girl is isolated and in her home, right? And that she's almost a prisoner of the social conditions that had led her parents to take that decision. And I know even in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure it happens in India as well, there's a lot of mother blaming and shaming and attributing, you know, congenital disabilities and infant impairments to mothers. So all these things together, remember I told you about the three systems of oppression coming together, patriarchy, ableism, and heterosexism, that which then gives rise to stigma can, without even us realizing, really lead to the isolation, the abandonment and exclusion of women and girls with disabilities, right? The deprivation of public participation, especially in Sri Lanka, where, for example, our literacy rate for women is very high, but the literacy rate for women with disabilities is very low in terms of even families and communities thinking that educating girls with disabilities is important. It's not even on the radar, right? The whole fact that maybe this child in the future can lead a life of contribution and dignity doesn't come into play, right? So when we have these access limitations, we call these experiences also microviolence, right? And also the access ecology for a lot of women and girls with disabilities, it's not just about inaccessible schools, it's also about inaccessible transportation, it's also about poverty, and it's also about, you know, the stares you get, right? The people who come and tell you, oh gosh, you've done something horrible in a past life and that's why you're a woman with a disability. All these things, you know, that are at the end of the day forms of violence, right? And I'm sure those of you, some of you who might be in this classroom, you have experienced that, you know, how the cultural narrative in itself is very degrading, right? But that said, although there are assumptions about one's limited capacity, so a lot of some of my friends who especially are from the rural areas of Sri Lanka say that they're expected to do the household chores, right? And kind of take care of those duties of labor, although the assumption is that they are of no use. So I'm just telling this from the perspective, especially of a friend of mine whose narrative is captured by video, and I'll show that to you in a bit, right? And also during abuse, where there's very limited family or community intervention. I mean, leaving disability aside, when we just talk about
Can you
GBV,
order
Geetika, can you please mute your mic? Right, thank you. So coming back to this, in terms of the whole idea that domestic violence or abuse within the home is a private matter. And this becomes even more so with the shame associated with women with disabilities, where then, you know, if you are isolated in a home, right, if you're not let out, whom do you go to for assistance, right? So that becomes a very tricky situation for a lot of women with disabilities. And also then from an early age that you may be then prone to be sold out for sex trafficking or domestic labor, right? Then when we look at the adolescence period for girls with disabilities or young women with disabilities, right? I spoke to you earlier about those norms, sexuality myths, you know, of a disabled girl is asexual or not sexually active, she's a virgin, or, you know, if you have sex with a disabled woman, you will be cured of HIV. So we have all these sexual myths around women and girls with disabilities as well, right? And because of this, women and girls with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be raped, and also they are more likely to experience violence within the family environment. Okay, I also spoke earlier about the lack of education and illiteracy, and a big part of this I mean, for all young women, I think in our region, is a lack of accessible sex education, right? Even if you go to a clinic, the assumption by physicians and service providers that you are not a sexual being, that, you know, the thought that, oh, I should test her for an STD doesn't even occur in the minds of a lot of healthcare providers, because we are not seen as sexual beings. And then this lack of accessible sex education really leads to people getting into situations that they don't even know what they're getting into, right? Across the board, I think, in a Sri Lankan context. Then we have the whole thing of adolescence and menstruation, right? Poor menstrual hygiene, menstruation taboos, and I'll look at how that influences the institutional frameworks when it comes to women with disabilities later. Also, the fact that a lot of us are subject to forced sterilization and hysterectomies, right? Being considered okay, especially this is the case of people with learning disabilities. The assumption that we can't take care of ourselves during menstruation, and hey, we are not going to have kids in any case, so why do we need reproductive organs? Let's just do, you know, a sterilization or hysterectomy in the best interest of the person or the family or whatever. You know, so the fact that this assumption itself is there is also again a form of or evidence of that larger systemic oppression. Okay, I'm now going to show you a video. The friend I earlier spoke about, who said that you know, in her experience, women and girls with disabilities are rendered role-less. I'm sure you have come across this in previous presentations, especially in a patriarchal structure, right? A woman's worth is often a woman's worth is often associated with her role as a mother, as a wife, as a carer, you know, all those things, especially in a South Asian context. And so this friend said, hey, you know, and I agree with her, that as women with disabilities, we are often rendered role-less, because people assume that, you know, we won't play those roles within our lives, you know, because of assumed incapacity or undesirability or asexuality or whatever that is, right? So a form of devaluation within the patriarchal system. I'm not saying that it's a horrible thing that, you know, we don't have access to marriage, but I'm saying is that within the structures of valued roles in society, that we are deprived of it. But what she says is, despite that, in her personal experience, she is expected to do all the household chores, you know, and care for nephews and nieces. So she was saying what a contradiction that is. The assumption that she can't be, you know, a wife or a mother, but then the expectation that she does all these chores and also attends to her nieces and nephews, right? So her name is Nisha. I will show you a video that UNDP did of Nisha and her take or experience of gender-based violence. Just give me a moment now, let's see. So she speaks in Sinhala at the start, but there are subtitles. Can you guys see the subtitles?
Yeah, it's visible, but I think it's a little down.
Really? Okay. Well, so what I'll do then is, while she speaks, I will read out the subtitles as well. Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right. I hired a taxi from a man from my village. He made several advances as we were going. Where are you going dressed so well? On a holiday? I said I was going to work. Then he said, you don't need to go. And he drove to a secluded road towards a guest house. He then said, why do you say, shall we, sorry. And I asked, are you going to move the vehicle or shall I call the police?
No, it's fine. Now the subtitles can be seen very clearly.
Awesome, great.
Some people might not be able to read subtitles.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I'll read it out as best as I can. Okay. Okay, let's see. Well, you know what I'll do? I'll play the video and then I will summarize it. I think that makes more sense, okay?
And time saves times also, probably.
Yeah.
මට ඕනේ යාට විරුද්ධ පොලිසිය යන්න අනික් කටියක වැළැක්වා පොලිසිය යන්න එපා දැන් ඔයා තනියම යන්නේ ඉන්නේ සමහරට ෆොටෝ එකක් අරගෙන ඉන්නේ එඩිට් කරලා පබ්ලික් කරයි.
An unspeakable act that most often concerns someone that you're taught to trust and rely upon. A crude act that's taboo to talk about, that could bring shame to the family if reported. The disabled are 7 times more prone to sexual abuse. Many of the differently able are often made to feel unworthy of being treated as ordinary human beings and are disregarded by society and sometimes even their own family.
නෑ කියලාවත් මාව කවුරු පිළිකට ගන්න කැමති නෑ අපේ වටේ නෑ ඉතින් ගියාම ගොඩක් ෆෝන් කරනවා මගේ පිළිකන්න දොරෙන් ගන්න කුසිය පැත්තෙන් ගන්න. මේ වගේ දේවල් ඉක්මනට පොඩි කාලේ මගේ හිතට වැදුනා ඒවා. හැම වෙලේම කාන්තාව දිහා ඒගොල්ලෝ ආබායිත කියන තැන ඉඳලා බලන්නේ මේ කාන්තාවට මුකුත් කරන්න බෑ කියලා. ඒ කියන්නේ යථාර්ථය දකින්නේ නැහැ.
ඒගොල්ලන්ගෙන් එන ෆැමිලි අනිවාර්යෙන් අපි විශේෂ දුසු කළ යුතුයි. රාජ්‍යවල නැහැ පැවිදි අතරම අපි. බැඳලා ඉන්න පොලිස් දාරින් විදිහට ඒක කරන්න අනිවාර්යෙන් කළ යුතුයි.
මිනිස්සුયો නම් අපි හැමෝම මිනිස්සුયો. එයාටත් පේනවා, එයාටත් ඇහෙනවා, එයාටත් දැනෙනවා, එයාටත් හැම දෙයක්ම අවශ්‍යයි. මට වගේම එයාටත් අවශ්‍යයි. අපි හැමෝගෙම තියෙන දුර්වලතාවය තමයි අපි මේ අපේ තේරුම් ගැනීම. අපි කොයි වෙලාවකවත් සම තත්ත්වයට අපි ඒගොල්ලන්ව හිතන්න තාම පුරුදු වෙලා නැහැ. අපි හිතනවා නම් මේ අයත් අපි වගේමයි කියලා ඒකේ වෙනසක් දැනෙනවා.
So, you know, before talking about the whole aspect of adulthood and gender-based violence, just to recap Nisha's experience, where she recounts a situation where she gets into a 3-wheeler or an auto or like tuk-tuk, whatever you call it there. And the driver says, oh, you're looking very good today. Where are you going? And, you know, she's like, not really your business. And then he tries to take her into a secluded place away from the others. And then she quickly says, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to get something from the office. Please take me back to the office. And, you know, she gets off. Then he takes her, fortunately, back to the office. And she just gets out. And she said, okay, I'll call you later. You know, takes the number and just kind of goes in the office and gets out of that very compromising situation. And then she says that when she went and told about this experience to her family, and she said, I want to make a complaint with the police, and the family has said, oh, don't do that, you know, maybe he will retaliate, he might take pictures of you and share them in social media, compromising kind of, you know, edited pictures. And so basically really discouraging her from taking any kind of legal action to address that situation, right? And then also she spoke about how, you know, growing up that she would be treated as like almost a third-class family member, and that she would have to come from the back of the house because her relatives didn't want the neighbors to see her coming. And, you know, like a lot of the really struggles that she's been through. But honestly, like as a colleague and a friend and an ally, she's like a fantastic voice in the disability sector in our country, especially for advocacy around the rights of women and girls with disabilities. But often, even those of us who are in the front lines really with the movement experience these forms of violence on a frequent basis, right? So then looking at the whole idea that she talked about, what is our state within the family environment, right? Especially in adulthood, where families often declare incapacity when it comes to women with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, often leading in that, to their institutionalization in care homes or mental health facilities, right? This declaration of incapacity becomes even more prominent when it comes to disputes around land rights, right? So there's this lack of agency or choice. Often other people make decisions for you. So substituted decision making and really working through guardianship arrangements. I know women who are very educated, who, you know, are again, really dynamic women with disabilities in our country, who don't have land rights, where parents would write off their properties to siblings without disabilities, and just with a little caveat or a note saying, please take care of your sibling with a disability, right? Again, perpetuating that model of care and dependence. Economic dependence, it's both a cause and an effect of violence, and especially in a COVID context, as I will look at soon. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, withholding food, mobility aids, assistive devices, right? And also within the power dynamic, right? When we look at the fact that we don't live in a free and fair world, right? That we live in a world that is defined by patriarchy, heterosexism, and ableism, that even within those care arrangements, that power dynamic can lead to situations of abuse and harm, okay? With a lot of people with psychosocial disabilities, this whole forced treatment, okay, being medicated for a lot of us without our consent or will, or subject to ECT or other forms of treatment, vulnerability when it comes to begging and other kinds of rackets and exploitative practices, okay, and this whole notion that even Nisha in the video talked about, of being damage grooms, right? That we are unsuitable for marriage, we are role-less, okay? And often then with the eugenic fears that come across when we do become pregnant or when we do give birth, leading to forced abortions or forced adoptions because of the assumption that we can't be mothers and carers, right? It's very interesting, the carer role that is assumed of women in a patriarchal setting in countries like ours. And then, like in Nisha's narrative, what happens to women with disabilities within the context of that role of carer, given the assumption that women with disabilities are recipients of care, right? Then abusive relationships, often we come, so with court cases, which I will look at very quickly. I know we don't have a lot of time, but this even assumption, and I've come across this when we work with grassroots level women, right? If you've been abused and you go to the police, attitudes like, well, you wouldn't have got any if not for this experience, so might as well be happy that, you got quote unquote laid. And you're like, wow. When I first came across that, a mother came to me and she was talking about the abuse of her daughter and that this was the police reaction. I couldn't believe it. But the fact is that you keep coming across this narrative over and over again, which is really heartbreaking in my opinion, right? Again, with intimate partner violence, again, looking at that power dynamic, often if women with disabilities get married, like the men, in Sri Lanka, I've heard people saying, oh, he's such a good man, he's saintly, he's like a bodhisattva. And I'm like, what? Right? But those are the kind of assumptions you have. And then when you have those assumptions, that you must be really grateful that some guy came and married you despite your disability. Like if that is the message you're giving, right? And getting rather from society, imagine the kind of behaviors that you are then expected to tolerate or almost be grateful for, right? And that exclusion from power at the end of the day, participate in decision making, okay, decision making regarding one's own life, one's community life, participation at the political and economic levels. All these lead to then that perceived powerlessness that I spoke of earlier, right? And when we look at that life cycle approach, older women are often neglected, and rendered homeless. Very quickly, institutionalization, maybe Shampa might talk about this as well. It's a core component of our topic today, right? When we are institutionalized, we automatically lose our legal capacity. The institution decides when we sleep, when we wake up, when we eat, when we, go to the bathroom even, right? So really a total loss to a great extent of our legal capacity, right? And then also again in the care relationship within institutions, and in Sri Lanka, there's no real proper monitoring mechanism. What happens in the context of that very compromising power relationship, right? Involuntary treatment, loss of access to financial resources, lack of privacy, right? I mean, how do you explore your sexuality within an institutional setting where sexuality is prohibited or seen as something criminal almost, right? I mean, it's a really sad situation, and it's sad for me because even, I mean, I'm guessing this is the case in India as well. Institutionalization still remains one of the core forms of almost living for women with disabilities. The other thing we need to keep in mind, especially when it comes to women with intellectual, learning, or psychosocial disabilities, is that disproportionate representation in jails and prisons, right? There was a case in the UK once about whether prisons are accessible for women with disabilities, okay? Imagine being in an inaccessible prison, that experience. Not that I'm saying that we must aspire to all end up in accessible prisons, right? We need to be cognizant of why have so many women with specifically these types of impairments ended up within the prison system, right? And again, all of this comes down to that notion of perceived vulnerability, okay? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to say that, if you are rendered dependent, right? If you are economically dependent, again, on your family or your carers, if you are not seen as being able to make a contribution to the economy or society, right? Often you are then in a state of poverty and dependence. And this poverty then leads to vulnerability to further poverty, ill health, right, impairment, and malnutrition, which just further exacerbates the experience of disability, right? And very quickly, the whole concept of intersectionality, which you may have covered in your previous lessons, right? Because disability is not our only identity, right? There are so many other axes of identity which may come together to create specific experiences. So for example, in Sri Lanka, I think not exactly race, but ethnicity is also a big axis of identity along where there is a lot of discrimination and oppression, right? So for example, I am a woman of a majority ethnic group, right? But I know when we take minority ethnic groups in Sri Lanka, like Tamils and Muslims, right? Their experience would be actually, more, what can I say, they would experience more barriers, by virtue of language, by virtue of assumptions, by virtue of prejudice, right? So these things also need to be taken into consideration, right? I've talked about a lot of these aspects of violence, so I'm not going to speak in detail, only to just say that when we are often told that we are not good enough, right? When we are emotionally or psychologically abused, okay, we tend to internalize that narrative. And I see this a lot with the women we work with, the internalization of the voice of abuse. Then you carry the voice of abuse with you, even when your abuser is not around. And that can be a really crushing experience, right? And the other thing is, like with Nisha's video, if you think that the family member who's a woman with disability is worthless, violence is normalized, okay? And like I told earlier, forced treatment, forced hysterectomies, if these are seen as good ways of managing people's menstruation, then no one is going to even question these practices as forms of violence, okay? But what we often see is that these forms of violence are actually normalized, right? Even in humanitarian settings, I'll talk about this very quickly, okay? So then the next aspect we need to look at is the justice system, right? Like I told earlier, how you'd go to the police and they'll either ridicule you or, tell you to enjoy it and move on. And a lot of the times, right, because of the existing shame and stigma around having a woman with a disability in the family, a lot of these cases of violence and abuse go unreported and unpunished, right? Then in terms of your capacity to witness, women especially who are blind or women who are deaf or hearing impaired, their testimonies are not given credibility within the justice system, at least in this country, which is really sad to even acknowledge, right? So the other thing of disbelief and negation, we have situations where family members, especially if another family member is the perpetrator, they might say, no, I don't believe you. I don't think that this person could have done something like that. And if then you are disbelieved by your carers, where do you go from there, right? So especially in terms of COVID-19 and disaster situations, many of you would have heard about gender-based violence being the hidden pandemic, not just for women and girls with disabilities, but for women around the world in general, right? It's been a very difficult time for all of us, emotionally draining, financially draining, a lot of stress within the family environment. And, it created a situation or even exacerbated the situation where the home is not a safe place anymore, right? We did a gender-based violence workshop with UNDP, I think it was December last year, right? And it was very interesting because we came across this situation where women with disabilities who were in abusive home environments had gone out of their home, so maybe come to places like Colombo or away from their hometowns to engage in employment and have some kind of economic independence, right? But then what they said is that during COVID, when all these offices and factories shut down, they had to go back home to that abusive and unsafe environment. And then they were like, oh gosh, why has this happened? I mean, these kind of things, in terms of providing safe spaces for workers, especially those with disabilities, who probably shouldn't go back to those abusive homes. These kind of things have been totally kind of underreported and non-acknowledged, right? In armed conflict, like I said, Sri Lanka has a history of armed conflict, girls and women with disabilities are at a much higher risk of abduction and sexual violence, right? And in war situations, disaster situations, for example, the tsunami, there were incidents of people, especially children with disabilities, being abandoned or left in care homes. If you have a lot of kids with disabilities in these institutions and care homes, and there's an emergency, there's, in Sri Lanka at least, there's no systematic approach when it comes to evacuating institutionalized settings, right? And then it leaves people in such a vulnerable situation, right? When we look at refugee camps and shelters, we don't think of accessibility, right? We don't think of accessible toilets or, ramps, or at least even something makeshift. And especially post-tsunami, especially with women with disabilities, women and girls are very vulnerable to rape and exploitation, right? So I know I don't have a lot of time left in terms of connecting this back to knowledge creation, right? If this is the ground situation, what can knowledge creation bring out? So both Asha here and Nandini, who are, the co-coordinators of this course, were involved in a COVID-19 study led by Women Enabled International and UNFPA. And the three of us were the coordinators for the South Asian segment, right? So we had 5 national consultations and 1 regional expert consultation. And the importance, rather than necessarily talking, I guess more than sharing the findings with you, the importance of doing a study like this is that there's very little baseline data or understanding or research when it comes to the situation of women in disaster situations, right? In disaster contexts. And COVID-19 being a pandemic, I mean, a lot of us didn't see that coming. When we talk about disaster situations, we think of hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis. We don't think of pandemics, but COVID has really pushed us to kind of look at a very different form of disaster or emergency situation. And the great thing about this consultation was to really be able to identify some of the key issues faced by women and girls with disabilities, right? So from basic needs to education to sexual reproductive health rights to gender-based violence. So especially around gender-based violence and sexual reproductive health, when we looked at basic services, you know, the fact that sanitary pads and contraceptives were not considered basic goods during this period, right? So that gave us the indication that, hey, we need to really get activated on this point, right? Access to healthcare. I will later share the PowerPoints with you, so you'll have access to most of this. You know, but in the case of emergency services, where, you know, people who are going through psychiatric emergencies did not get any emergency care. So if you had a psychiatric emergency and you called the hospital, you know, they so the preference were for COVID-related calls. And so a lot of those persons who needed emergency treatment in certain situations could not get that treatment. Who I think I have about 2 more minutes. No? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just skip through all of these and just looking at, you know, how can we, given these existing vulnerabilities and experiences, move forward, right? The great thing about knowledge generation and research of this kind is that we are at a better situation to prepare for future waves and similar emergencies, right? And to include women and girls with disabilities in that process, right? A big thing that was lacking, especially for deaf women and women who are hard of hearing, was the lack of access to information. And in terms of knowledge generation, something that happened, which I'm really happy about, especially in South Asia, was that people took these government announcements and then made sign language versions of those announcements and put it out on social media, right? So this was one of the ways in which women were able to empower themselves and inform themselves, right? This whole menstrual product and aid packages, a lot of women with disabilities got activated on that. I know in Pakistan, there's the Girly Things website, Tanzila Khan. We also had like a small youth kind of consultation on what are the best ways in which we can get these menstrual products and services across to women and girls with disabilities in rural parts of our countries. Specifically, it was looking at Pakistan and Sri Lanka, right? So there has been, the great thing is when we get together to create knowledge, to figure out what's going on, we can really learn from each other, right? And then kind of see how that works in the local context, right? As I told earlier, who do I have about 2-3 more minutes?
Please go ahead. 2
Okay,
minutes
all
more.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Right. So, and the other thing that we learned from this COVID experience is when we sensitize, we need to sensitize all stakeholders. So often we sensitize women with disabilities, but we don't look at their family members, their spouses, their mothers, their carers, and all that. And at the end of the day, in reality, they have to negotiate their position or even that power dynamic within the context of that family and home, you know. So how do we then do that in creative ways while recognizing the specific cultural sensitivities in our region, right? So that is something important that I personally learned in terms of how do I, you know, work in the future with communities. This twin track approach, which is about mainstreaming disability, but also having disability specific affirmative initiatives is very important, right? Comprehensive sex education, and something that we don't even talk about, accessible safe houses. I know we don't have accessible safe houses here in Sri Lanka, right? So, I mean, just being stuck in an abusive family situation and getting out of it is a Herculean task for women with disabilities. But then where do they go beyond that, you know? So it's kind of, and then to look at access ecology is looking at all aspects of access without just, you know, looking at like a piecemeal approach to access. Robust legal mechanisms. I know in Sri Lanka, we really need legal reform when it comes to reporting abuse and legal recourse for women and girls with disabilities. right? And to actively ensure that all GBV services are fully accessible and inclusive. And with the kind of research that Nandini, Ash, and I were coordinating earlier, this gap for disability specific and disaggregated data, we also need to kind of address, right? So accessible services and programming. Okay, and also to strengthen government entities, because we have like the National Council for Persons with Disabilities and other kind of organizations, but they're like paper tigers, right? Toothless tigers, right? So so those are some of the things. So basically saying in conclusion that when we look at the life cycle of women and girls with disabilities, we experience violence in different forms and different contexts throughout our life cycle. And that is exacerbated during times of emergency, like the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Which is why we really need to then collectively come together to share our experience and expertise in especially the South Asian region, in my opinion, in order to have socially, culturally specific interventions that ensure that we don't leave anyone behind. So that said, I'll just wrap up for now, and then maybe later, if anyone has any questions, could ask me later. So thank you, Kuhu.
Thank you, Niluka. It was really wonderful, very enriching, and lots of informations. As you said that you will be sharing this with the participants. So yeah, that's a good thing. So everybody can go through it more, details, and then can have their more understanding much better. Thank you so much, Niluka. As of now, there is only one question for you. So we will just move on. Maybe we can, the question is, I guess you also have the question that Priyadarshini has asked, that is female circumcision, stroke genital mutilation, prevalence among women with disabilities, though many of them can't take care of themselves. I think you have already said many things, not particularly this thing, but many things around what happens with women, when it comes to violence and abuse in the home situation. Yeah. So would you like to respond to that in very quickly?
Yeah, very quickly I'll say that. Thank you, Priyadarshini. It's a very important question, right? If you look at studies, especially relating to Africa, I think there's a very good, when I share my PowerPoint, I'll share the link to that as well so that you can check it yourself. Female circumcision, genital mutilation also becomes a big source of impairment, right? And injury for women with disabilities if it's done, not even women without disabilities, gaining impairments if it's done in an unhygienic and unsafe manner. Okay, so yes, it's quite prevalent, and it's definitely a source of impairment for a lot of women in countries where it is commonly practiced. And I will send the link across with the PowerPoint so you can read a bit more about it.
Thank you, Niluka. And Priyadarshini, I think you have got the response. Please go through the link which Niluka is going to send. Ashadi, would you like to say something?
No, nothing much, Kuhu, except telling the participants that what Niluka spoke, they're supposed to make some poster presentations.
Yeah.
So I think this is one good place to get those done, because she did an exhaustive presentation and a lot of data also.
Yeah.
And so they could think of making their posters on that. And also, I think one of the things that violence creates within society like ours is also what Niluka said, that, women with disabilities rarely come forward to come and complain. But as we are going along now, you see that more and more women are coming forward. And I think we need a situation built within our system, whether it is research or whether it is in activism, that we bring the women who want to speak forward by creating a system where it is possible to do so, because the amount of information with the police, with the judges, is so little on disability that that system cannot come unless they are sensitized enough to understand what they're saying. And even what I don't know about Sri Lanka, but in India, still, the use of for deaf people to go and become witnesses of a blind, the space is very limited. And as witnesses also, they do not get into the system, which we have to now think about, not only about our from an academic point of view, but also from an action, link it to action. And I think this is where Shampa's talk will come in cohesion with what Niluka said in, in giving the statistics, the issues that are there. Um, so I think a lot of posters, I'm speaking now to the students, can also be prepared from these. How you go from, because they've been told to do posters which are which also will have an action for 6 months down the line. Thank you, Kuhu.
Right. Thank you, Ashadi. And I think that's a very, very important point brought forward by Ashadi. All the participants will be working after this session, after this course. I'm guessing that. Yeah, Shampa have a vast experience, and she will also give some case studies. Probably, I'm not sure, but when all the participant goes out into the field, and please keep this in their mind that we need more in evidence-based data to really create the sensitization and awareness and give more women with disabilities to come forward and narrate their abuses, whoever wants to do that. And that will really create a powerful evidence-based data which will back up the qualitative data, and then we can we will have a kindly positive situation to fight for the rights and also to stop the violence against women with disabilities.